Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jaleesa Gilmore with Groundwork USA, and welcome to the Urban Waters Learning Network webinar, Community-Centered Solutions for Green Gentrification and Displacement. Next slide. And so before we get started today, I just wanted to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out after the call. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, where you're calling from, but please keep yourself on mute to reduce the background noise, and feel free to use the chat for any questions or comments. And we'll be monitoring the chat to capture questions, and we'll follow directly after presentations with a Q&A session. Next slide. Great. So today's webinar is hosted by the Urban Waters Learning Network. The Urban Waters Learning Network is a peer-to-peer network of people and organizations working to conserve, restore, and revitalize America's urban waterways, supporting our members' work through tools, training, mentoring, and financial assistance. The Urban Waters Learning Network is co-coordinated by River Network and Groundwork USA with support from the EPA and the National Park Service. Next slide. And today's webinar is part of our learning series From Silos to Synergy, integrating land and water programs for holistic environmental action. And so the thought behind this webinar series was land, air, and water systems are interconnected, and to approach healing and past harms and creating a more just future needs to be as well. And so this series is designed to help land and water equity practitioners think beyond traditional program silos. And so we kicked off this series last year, delving into brownfields and equitable development, as well as federal tools for environmental justice. Next slide. And so today's webinar, we'll hear from both the River Network and South Bronx Unite, from Renee Mazurek, Grace Fulmer, Arif Ullah. And so Renee Mazurek, our first speaker, as the Resilient Community Managers at River Network, Renee shares success stories from network members and projects through impact stories and story maps, and supports collaborative efforts for equitable development and trust-based philanthropy. Renee's background is in geology, and she has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Pittsburgh and a Master's of Science from East Carolina University. In Western North Carolina, where she lives now, Renee taught college-level geology and environmental science at several colleges and universities for over 10 years. Outside of work, Renee enjoys reading, bullet journaling, and spending time outside hiking and camping with her family and friends. Grace Fulmer is the Corporate Engagement Manager and supports the Corporate Partnerships program by connecting with local partners to implement programs that enhance and protect water quality for all. Grace earned her Bachelor's of Science degree in Environmental and Organic Biology from Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, and her Master's of Science in the Human Dimension of Natural Resources from Colorado State University. Since receiving her bachelor's degree, Grace has traveled extensively around the world, volunteering and working for a variety of environmental organizations, supporting everything from coral reef restoration in Indonesia to environmental education in Nicaragua. As well, she has worked for numerous organizations in the U.S. focusing on equitable community engagement to ensure natural resource projects are serving not only the surrounding natural environment, but also the well-being of human communities. Outside of work, Grace is found exploring all sorts of landscapes with her shepherd mix Koya, stitching embroidered southwestern plants and animals, spending quality time with her community of family and friends, and when she gets the chance, going on nature walks with her niece. Arif Ullah. Arif is a social and environmental justice advocate, grassroots urban planner, and community activist with more than 20 years of experience in designing and managing community development programs, establishing diverse alliances, and co-creating campaign strategies around local, state, and national issues. Prior to joining South Bronx Unite, Arif was director of programs at an organization that supported hundreds of grassroots groups every year in their self-determined efforts to improve the quality of life in under-resourced neighborhoods across New York City. Before that, he worked as an immigrants' rights advocate with American Friends Service Committee. He currently serves on the Mayor's Sustainability Advisory Board, the Anthropocene Alliance's Board of Directors, Will Cornell's Cool Trees Advisory Boards, and the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program Management Committee. He is a co-founder of the Bangladeshi Americans for Political Progress and a core member of Malcolm X Community Garden. Arif graduated from Hunter College and has a master's in public policy from Duke University. In his free time, he grows food and keeps honeybees at his community garden. Arif believes in the power of frontline communities, and he is committed to building systems that support their health, creativity, wisdom, and leadership. Thank you, Renee, Grace, and Arif, for agreeing to be a speaker today. And with that, I'll remind everyone to introduce themselves in the chat, keep yourselves on mute, and we will be doing a Q&A after the presentation. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And I will pass it to Renee.
Yeah, thanks, Jaleesa. And yeah, we're really grateful to have Arif with us here today as well. So thanks for doing those introductions. The toolkit that we are presenting today is called Community-Centered Solutions for Advancing Equitable Development and Anti-Displacement. So I'm going to start really with giving some background. First with, River Network, who we are and what we do. If you're not familiar, like the Urban Waters Learning Network, we are a national network of peers working on water justice and river advocacy. And we connect people through things like our conference, River Rally. We strengthen groups working on rivers across the country with funds, technical assistance, learning sessions similar to this and more. And we help to transform by providing innovative solutions and sharing those out with our partners. Like Jaleesa said, the River Network is one of the co-coordinators of the Urban Waters Learning Network. And that's where a lot of my work for River Network starts, is really with Urban Waters and the Urban Waters Learning Network. And in particular, my work with Equitable Development has been with a group of community leaders in what we call the Urban Waters Learning Network Collaborative, or Equitable Development and Anti-Displacement Collaborative. So this is a group of folks from around different places in the country who, when we came together and started talking about, what is equitable development, what are the challenges that you're facing in your communities as you're advocating for, or as you're building green infrastructure or resilience or waterfront development, we found a lot of similarities in all of the different places, even though the work was slightly different. And so first, we just really connected and built some relationships with one another. And we've been working together now as a collaborative for, this will be our 5th year. And so we have convened to listen, to learn, and to create resources. So we do have a bunch of resources that the collaborative has created, and you can find those on the website that was just dropped in the chat. And we are getting ready to reconvene again for this year and to set priorities for moving forward. Just to give you a little bit more idea about the equitable development work that we've done, we do have a mobilized group that you can sign up for, and that's also in the chat, and it's specifically dedicated to conversations and resource sharing around equitable development. I've just spoken about the collaborative. The collaborative is still meeting, and it was the collaborative who really brought to us the idea of, what about the development of a toolkit? And so with the support of the National Park Service, Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, we were able to develop a toolkit with an advocacy group or with an advisory group. And some of the members from the collaborative and others were part of that advisory group. And that toolkit was published in September of last year. Some other things that we do on the topic of equitable development. Last year was the first year that we hosted quarterly peer calls, and those are very informal spaces to come together and have conversations and share resources with peers, and then doing webinars and trainings, kind of like this one that we're doing today. So we do want to get into the toolkit and talk about that, but before launching directly into that, I think it's really important to set the stage and go through a couple of definitions so that we're all kind of on the same place. When I say displacement, when we say gentrification, these are what we're referring to in the toolkit. And a lot of times I've heard gentrification and displacement being used synonymously, but there are very distinct differences. So we're going to go through just briefly a review of these terms. And we do have more resources on that website. If you want to dig deeper into each of them, you can find more details. But displacement happens when residents are pushed out of their neighborhoods. And this can be due to various direct and indirect drivers. So the image or the diagram that's over on the right of the screen has a couple of examples of what those drivers can be. Gentrification is one of them, and gentrification can contribute to several of these other drivers, the rising cost of living or land values, as well as cultural changes in neighborhoods. Green infrastructure investments can lead to gentrification. So gentrification is one of the drivers of displacement. Displacement is when folks are pushed out of their neighborhoods. So let's talk about what is gentrification. Gentrification, defined by the Office of Environmental Justice, is the process of neighborhood change that occurs as places of lower real estate value are transformed into places of higher real estate value. This means land values, property values go up. This can be caused, and what the term green gentrification can cause property values to go up. There are some really great resources on that website, and we've shared in lots of different places through the years of studies that show that investments in parks, green infrastructure, and other kinds of environmental restoration can add to displacement pressures in neighborhoods. But there's a growing understanding that gentrification doesn't have to lead to displacement if it's done in a different way. And so I include this definition down here with gentrification. This is a term that's coined by Pastor John Wallace that describes when residents within a community are leading that neighborhood revitalization along efforts to remain in place. That was really quick. And like I said, if you're curious for more resources on all of this, you can find them on our landing page on the website. And then finally, what do we mean by equitable development? Again, through the Office of Environmental Justice, it's an approach for meeting the needs of underserved communities through policies and programs that reduce disparities while fostering places that are healthy and vibrant. And we agree, and we also kind of expanded this in the toolkit to recognize that the cycles of gentrification and displacement that are at play, and also recognizing that, oftentimes the communities that we're looking to revitalize need those revitalizations. There's been divestment in communities that was oftentimes intentionally done, and we'll get into a little bit of history and context here. So the want to improve and make communities more healthy and vibrant is right, but just recognizing that they can change the neighborhood characteristics, and so we really put that up front and central, and then talk about ways in which we can start to change that dynamic. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Grace, and she will talk to us about this business as usual versus a new model.
Thank you, Renee, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Glad to see you in this space. So within this toolkit, we're kind of presenting some ways, some ideas, some strategies for how we can interrupt business as usual projects. And we refer to these projects as those that are not really wanting or not accounting for community needs and wants, specifically within disproportionately impacted communities, and they further perpetuate or can further perpetuate, right, gentrification and displacement. So kind of just going through really quickly how we have seen business as usual projects is coming into communities with some initial investments. With that investment comes potentially an idea as to what you already want to do, right? Maybe that's installing or building a greenway or a park in certain communities. And then we move on to community engagement. But this community engagement is done solely just to check a box and not necessarily for incorporating what we hear within community engagement activities, not incorporating that into the project plan, right? Essentially not necessarily listening to the community needs or wants. And then that development proceeds, right? Again, without incorporating the input and also not implementing or trying to integrate any sort of remain in place policies or strategies that we'll be introducing today. And then gentrification can occur, cost of living increases, and as Renee mentioned, displacement can result. So this is sort of this business as usual model that we are hoping with this toolkit and some of the strategies presented, we can interrupt. You can go to the next slide, Renee. So just to talk a little bit about what some business as usual projects have been and sort of the implications of them, we have some examples. So there was this 606 project in Chicago, which was about a 3-mile linear park and transportation corridor in Chicago's northwest side. And it was dividing these two neighborhoods, so 606 East and 606 West, where 606 West was mostly low-income community of color, and the East Side being higher income, white majority of residents living there. With the development of the trail, they saw as a result that real estate prices increased, specifically within the West Side, right? The lower income, greatly community of color, cost of living was increasing and saw a lot of changes. So we can kind of see in this example that with the implementation, the development of this trail, there were impacts, right? Gentrification's happening, displacement's happening. There's another example in Atlanta with this 22-mile rail-to-trail corridor. Again, it was built kind of separating two communities and did go through some low-income community of color neighborhoods. And initially, this plan, they wanted to think about can we build, we want to build some affordable housing units. So they had a goal of building 5,600 units. And this project broke ground in 2005. A study came out in 2017 to just kind of see how is this going, right? What impacts are we seeing? What's happening as a result of this project being built? And they saw that there weren't as many affordable housing units built. Only 800 were built within that after that 12-year span. So pretty significant drop from what their goal was. And in addition, again, similar to the 606 project in Chicago, cost of living was increasing. Housing costs were going up in the lower income community of color neighborhoods. And while they were trying to implement some practices and had some goals, the study was saying, it's 10 years too late. If maybe some of this work was done way on the front end, we might have been able to reduce some of these displacement and gentrification impacts. So these two projects kind of highlight, right? There are changes that come from these greening projects or from restoration work. And so thinking of ways and how can we introduce some strategies to curtail some of these risks and threats. You can go to the next slide, Renee. So we present ways to interrupt the cycle. So the purple here are different strategies that we propose to implement. Some different anti-displacement strategies that we hope can lead to community members having the opportunity to stay in place as opposed to being forced out. So starting with this yellow star, this community-led vision of having an understanding initially of what is this community where you're wanting to work or are currently working, what do they want, what do they need? And this might go beyond any sort of green infrastructure. It could be needing assistance with fixing a fence or their roof or anything sort of related to something that can help build community resilience beyond kind of our traditional green projects. So having an idea of what are the needs, what are the wants, and then incorporating those into these initial investments into the projects that we're coming in with. And continuing to do authentic community engagement over the course of the project. So it's not just in the very beginning, but it will happen throughout. And in this moment, right, also, can we identify some local leaders who can really speak for some of the community members who are not able to attend, or maybe they can become leaders and lead the project forward. They can be the voice. So continuing this community engagement and making sure that priorities that the community has outlined are incorporated into this work over the course of the project. And then additionally, right, I think probably many of us on this call work within the environmental space, and we don't have expertise in everything. So forming deep partnerships to invest in multiple benefits. Can we identify some groups who do have expertise in affordable housing or in policy creation? How can we lean on some other folks within our communities to help us advance the goals that we're wanting to meet with incorporating anti-displacement strategies? So creating a pretty diverse team and setting goals within that team. And then hopefully, right, if we're introducing these different strategies over the course of the project and checking in, hopefully equitable growth can occur and displacement can be avoided. And residents of the neighborhood, again, have this option to stay in place and experience the benefits of some of these projects, right? Have experienced the benefit of having closer access to a park, the ability maybe to walk to a community gathering. And then again, hopefully displacement doesn't happen. So kind of jumping into the toolkit, this is just a broad overview of what we have in it. So we introduce a historical background and context for this work. Then we introduce some strategies for addressing the risk. So looking inward, either to yourself as an individual, your organization, your project team, your partnership, and then looking outward, more of doing this work within the community and starting actually, when breaking ground on your project. And then at the end, we tie it all together. Also scattered throughout, we have some case studies, and Arif, who's on the call with us today, is one of those case studies in the South Bronx. And we also provide loads of resources for other toolkits that have already been created. We're not trying to recreate the wheel with this toolkit. We just want to kind of create a space where folks can come and point you to different resources that are already in existence to help you do this work. So kind of jumping a little bit more into the toolkit itself, I'm going to really briefly touch on this piece. But we find it important before even doing this work is to kind of gather us and ground us in the context and history as to why we're here today talking about anti-displacement strategies within greening projects. So we kind of look back to the 1930s, and part of the New Deal was a term, redlining. And redlining has come to mean racial discrimination of any kind in housing. And it comes from these government maps that were created. And essentially, they outlined areas in a city for risk of lending. So oftentimes, well, all the time, White communities were outlined in green, and this represented low risk of lending. And then Black communities were outlined in red. This was a higher risk of lending. And so these discriminatory maps allowed for or didn't allow for these Black communities to receive a mortgage or to receive a loan to further build their wealth. In addition, there was a lack of investment in infrastructure and a variety of other things in these communities. And so today we see these huge gaps between the white neighborhoods as compared to the Black neighborhoods, where there's a wealth gaps, health gaps, and also climatically, right? A lot of these redline communities experience the most and the worst impacts from climate change. We're seeing intense flooding, and even beyond some of these really big flooding events, there's consistent flooding that can happen that really impacts a community. We can also see food deserts, lack of ability to receive nearby or close adequate health care, and also, intense heat. And so we can see that redlining has really led to the creation as to why many of these communities look the way they do today, and also the importance of introducing these anti-displacement strategies into our work. We can also think about environmental justice coming out in this space as well in the 1960s, of understanding that these neighborhoods have really been discriminated against, and how can we implement different practices and tools to address some of the wrongs of the past. So we really find it important to understand this context and history when working in this space. Apologies if you can hear my dog playing with her toy in the background. She just came in and is very excited. So kind of jumping into the strategies of this work. So first, focusing internally. We recognize, and it's important for us as green organizations to take a look from within and evaluate ourselves and ask ourselves, what's our mission? Does it reflect the priorities of communities we're trying to serve? Have our staff participated in DEI trainings? Or are they continuing to participate in DEI trainings? So really prioritizing this work with new staff members, or just continuing to always be learning in this space. And we provide a lot of resources in the toolkit here. And then setting your intention for incorporating anti-displacement techniques into your work. What is your why behind wanting to do this? We find that this work is really, it's not easy, and we're not saying that in this toolkit. It's really challenging and can take time and a lot of effort. And so setting your intention is a space where maybe if you're feeling burnt out or concerned, or where, we're not making any changes, can you come back to that intention to help move you forward? It's also a great way to get other folks, other project partners or leadership involved, and get them on board, and also a great way to find additional funding sources. Finally, thinking about addressing your barriers. We found that a lot of folks experience different barriers when thinking about doing this work, such as a lack of community trust, or again, leadership is not invested in doing this work. It's challenging. We don't have funding to do the work. So thinking ahead of time, what are some of the barriers that you might have when doing this work, and what are some tactics that you can come up with to address those barriers, and what are the resources needed? We recommend really starting with that low-hanging fruit, right? We might not be able to change the entire system, but can we have small wins along the way? Can we start somewhere? That is kind of one of our taglines, I think, is start today, start where you are. And then moving into, again, more of this internal work is fostering community trust. We talked about the context and history of a lot of this work, and there can be a deep lack of trust within some of these communities where we're working, and all of that is very valid. And so thinking about in this space, the organization that you're working with. What is the history of that organization working within this community? Have there been some missteps along the way? Has something happened to maybe break some trust? Additionally, it might not be your organization, but just rather some outsiders coming into a community that has really been blighted and discriminated against for a long time. So thinking about the history of you, your partnering organization, and what that might be in that community, and working to try to rebuild that trust, which we offer some different tips in the toolkit. And then again, fostering leadership commitment, getting them on board, knowing that you have the power and the ability to help get them on board and make them interested in doing this work, and maybe sharing some education with them on the importance and why we need to be implementing different strategies. And then also funding and budgeting to do the work, making sure that we are incorporating and having some line items for community participation, offering stipends. This isn't necessarily their job when you're going out and asking them what they need or want. So can we make sure that we are compensating them for their time, and getting creative with different funding sources, right? This work touches on various sectors within society. And so can we try to find funding in some other places that we otherwise wouldn't have looked? Pass it over to Renee to start talking about strategies for external work.
Yeah, so in the toolkit, we have it separated into these pieces, the history, the internal work, and then there's a whole section on external work as well. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about a little bit. And each step of the way, we have created these worksheets, and those worksheets are available as appendices at the end of the toolkit as well. So just keep that in mind. But the first piece of the external work that we suggest is understanding and engaging communities. And just as Grace said, that a lot of the communities have been engaged a lot, and have been asked similar questions repeatedly. And so doing what is called pre-community engagement might be a little bit new and different to some folks who are familiar with doing this kind of work. But pre-community engagement is really, and we do have a highlighted case study in the toolkit about this. And there's a resource that, thank you, Natalia, just dropped in the chat for pre-community engagement. But it's about understanding the history of place, the history, and then understanding the place as it is now and how it got to be the way that it is now, and recognizing that these communities have heard the same questions again and again. So doing the research before even going into the community to do the engagement that you want to do. Making connections with folks, conducting interviews, and getting a broad spectrum across the board from community members. And one of the outcomes from the case study when they did pre-community engagement was then to put together an advisory group that actually matched the demographics of the community that they were working in. So that's one step and one suggestion, a resource that we highlight in the toolkit. And then again, community engagement resources, I know a lot of people on this call probably have some that they could share, right? So we're not suggesting that we have all of them, or we didn't even try to put all of them into the toolkit. We suggested a few that we're familiar with. But really what it comes down to is the importance that, community engagement is intentional and authentic. And so we shared some helpful examples there. Another piece of this work and doing this externally is starting to build a team. So there's no catch-all, this is what a team should look like. I think it's going to be individual for each community, for each project. But looking into, who is it that's doing the work in the community, and coming up with a collaborative team that will come from multiple sectors. So including the community, the environmental organizations, it's probably going to have folks from housing organizations, workforce development, even developers can be involved in this conversation. Sometimes, if we don't have a whole lot of case studies that show where that's happened, but we're actively looking for those kinds of things and advocating for that to happen as well. So there are some really great resources, and we highlight some examples in the toolkit from the Collective Impact Forum, and understanding how to do some of this kind of collaborative work. Again, and Grace said this, we know this work isn't easy. I'm not just saying go out there and do collaborative work. Like, this does take time, and just recognizing that, you know, there are shifts in the way that we have to think about these kinds of processes. But once you do have a team of folks together, then it's like coming together with that collaboration, having an organization who's kind of on task for leading and organizing the collaborations is really important. And again, the Collective Impact Forum has great resources on that. But then once you're together, creating the toolbox, like what are the strategies and who is going to do them is the next step. A lot of people are probably familiar with the 11th Street Bridge Park. They have developed iterations of this equitable development plan for the last decade. You don't necessarily have to put a plan together that's as detailed as this one or others that are starting to be developed. But they are helpful, and it's helpful to have a clear idea of, you know, what are the strategies and who is going to do them. And again, it will be a little bit different than from community to community. And this is where it's really important to do that authentic community engagement to understand what are the priorities and how can this work have multiple benefits. And then I do want to say, you know, a lot of times these projects take a really long time, especially if they're really large projects. And it can be fatiguing for the community to be engaged over such a long term. So like we do include some tips for this long-term community engagement. The case study that we included on Arif's work, and I'm going to turn it over to him very soon, it does address some of those tips for continued long-term engagement and work like this. But we also, you know, think about this in terms of what are your smaller wins? How can you engage with the community? Find things like a roof repair or a fence fix that a community member needs in the process of designing an overall green infrastructure plan for the community as well. So, you know, keeping connections with the community, making fun events, and trying to find those small wins. So we include some tips and other resources to also think about continuing engagement with communities. And even if your project is finished, there are ways that you can continue to be engaged and keep those connections going. So then we do try to tie this all together with a diagram at the end of the toolkit. And this is kind of a guiding illustration of maybe identifying, like, what are the things that we are doing? What are the things that we're not doing? How can we get into the process? I think Grace said it, and I'm going to say it again. It's like, start where you are, but start today and see where you can plug into these processes and how you can start to change the business as usual kind of dynamics that happen when we're doing, you know, large or even sometimes the smaller projects can have changes to community dynamics. I do have a slide in here with some case study examples. We've referred to a couple of them throughout the talk. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I'm really happy that Arif is here to talk about his case study himself. So before we do hand it over to Arif, though, I do want to give you a little bit more information about what River Network's next plans are. So we're in the process of developing some online resources around this toolkit. So we're going to try to have it accessible via like an online platform. We will be this year developing some new training materials and training opportunities. The toolkit will be translated into Spanish. The text has already been translated, but the next step is getting it back into the design And we also would like to hear from you, like what would be useful to you? We have done these peer calls I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that happened on a quarterly basis, very informal conversations. Some of our colleagues at River Network have created online learning modules like the Clean Water Act self-paced training series. So that's something that we could think about developing as well. But we have a short poll that I would ask Natalia to launch um, for us here to just tell us a little bit more about, what would be useful to you from the toolkit. And go ahead and take a minute to weigh in on how you might use this. And if there's nothing in there that seems applicable to you, please go ahead and drop something in the chat. We're definitely going to be paying attention to all of these different options. Great, thank you so much. We're almost at the 50% mark. Great. And just gonna leave it open for about another 30 seconds. So if you haven't weighed in, please do. We really will use this feedback as we start developing more materials on this topic. And still coming in. Great. And let's say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And Natalia, go ahead and end the poll. And can we share the results? So it looks like most interest in like asynchronous training models. Great, thank you. There's one-pagers and fact sheets, webinars with case studies. These are things we're definitely planning to do. More peer discussions. If you are interested in those peer discussions, please feel free to send me your email, direct chat here in this Zoom so that I have it and I can invite you to those as well. In-person workshops, feel free to reach out to Grace and I as well. But I think we can stop sharing, and then I am going to hand it over to Arif. Arif, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you for this really important conversation. And to all those who are tuning in, all of the topics that you all are covering are ones that are very, very important to us. And I wanted to just give you a sense of what we're confronting in the South Bronx when it comes to redlining, when it comes to displacement, when it comes to gentrification, when it comes to polluting infrastructure, all of which are very, very interconnected. So what we're looking at in this picture is our waterfront. Whereas many other communities in New York City have beautiful green waterfronts, and there's what I call a waterfront renaissance that has been happening in New York City for the last 15, 20 years. Instead, what we have in the South Bronx, particularly in our section of the South Bronx, which is Mott Haven, Port Morris, the South Bronx is comprised of several neighborhoods. Mott Haven, Port Morris is one section of the South Bronx. It's the southernmost tip of the South Bronx, again, a peninsula. And we have 4 power plants. So you see one site here. We have last mile warehouses. We have waste transfer facilities. We have medical waste facility. And we have on top of that a real heavy concentration of highways, expressways, and byways. In the distance, well, actually not in the distance, at the top you see a green area, and that's Randall's Island, and that is a green space, but that's not in the South Bronx. It's almost teasing us there. But we're friends with the folks over at the Randall's Island Park Alliance, and they try to do right by us and try to draw attention to what we're experiencing in the South Bronx. But it is, I think this picture is especially poignant because it really does show you what we can create in the South Bronx. There's no reason why we can't be as green or at least have some more greenery. Just as background, well, actually, you know what? Why don't we move over to the next slide and I can give you some more information as I talk. This is another polluting facility, Fresh Direct. It's a grocery delivery site. And just this warehouse alone sees 1,000 daily truck trips in our community. And these are all diesel engine trucks that are pulling the community. And in the foreground, what you have is the garbage train essentially. So just near Fresh Direct, we have a waste management facility that processes the household waste of the entire Bronx. And this train comes in to collect the waste once a day and then take it out after that. Now, Fresh Direct, and I want to mention this because uh, it has been mentioned before that companies come in to communities like ours, sort of dangling, sort of benefits, whereas, ultimately many of those benefits don't really materialize or aren't meaningful. So Fresh Direct, which by the way was incentivized to locate to our community, an already pollution burdened community with $140 million in city and taxpayer subsidies. So our policymakers thought that it was entirely fine to bring another polluting facility into the South Bronx. And not just that, but give them $140 million in taxpayer subsidies. So Fresh Direct dangled jobs as so many companies do. And of course, the community like the South Bronx, where there is a high unemployment rate, needs jobs, but very few of those jobs actually went to local community members. And also, even if more jobs went to local community members, this is a community that simply can't shoulder any additional pollution burden. Relating that to redlining, which was discussed or mentioned earlier, this is a community that had been redlined. And redlining isn't something of the past. The legacy of redlining continues. And so when you see facilities like this, that even in this day and age continue to set up in neighborhoods like ours, it is because of the legacy of redlining, because what that did is make us into a sacrifice zone, right? The lives of people who live in this community, Black, brown, immigrant folks. And in this case, but I really also want to acknowledge that there are communities, let's say in West Virginia, which are poor white folks, right? It's just it really is a matter of both class and race. That those are communities that are struggling as well, and their lives are considered expendable too by corporations. And so they've set up these through redlining and other public policies, these sacrifice zones, which makes it entirely okay to set up these types of polluting facilities, because again, the lives of people in those communities aren't considered as valuable. And so it doesn't matter if people are suffering from incredibly high rates of asthma, which we do, or other related illnesses. The lives don't matter as much. And so these policies and both historic and newer policies continue to resonate in the South Bronx. In the mid 20th century, we had urban renewal programs, which also essentially devastated communities like the South Bronx, and those effects continue to ripple, through the 2020s. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a vision for what well, this is a sort of a snapshot of the entire area, and I'll get to the vision in just a little bit. And it shows you the high concentration of polluting facilities. So I went over a couple of, right, the Fresh Direct warehouse, one side of the power plant, etc. But like, this is the concentration of polluting facilities in just a small area. This is not a large area that we're talking about. It's a fairly small area, and there is no waterfront access to this area. And even if there is no green space to invite people into this area. And uh, and just recently, one of the ideas that was proposed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they were tasked by New York and New Jersey to come up with a plan for flood protection. This was in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, to protect coastal communities from climate change related sea level rise and coastal storms. And what they proposed for our section of the city for the South Bronx was an on-land seawall. And so whereas other communities in the area, the proposition was for um, green spaces, raised promenades, etc. What they proposed for our part of the city was an on-land seawall, which would permanently sever the community off from the waterfront. And when we asked them why would we be getting an on-land seawall, whereas other communities in New York City would be getting raised promenades and improved green spaces, their response was, well, we looked at existing features that community already has. And what I responded with was, well, you're perpetuating racism then. Of course, we don't have those existing features that more wealthier communities in New York City have. And so why would you be looking at just existing features that just perpetuates racism? So, it's not that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers
With that partner request,
is bad. It's that
they
they have some serious blind spots. And it is up to them. It is their responsibility not to have those blind spots without question. And they need to do their homework better. And at the same time, I mean, we do have that burden of pointing out to them their shortcomings and making sure that these types of injustices aren't perpetuated. Because again, if an organization like South Bronx Unite didn't exist and didn't push back, and other organizations in New York City, then this plan would be going forward as proposed. But thankfully, because South Bronx Unite pushed back against this Army Corps plan, as did many other frontline community organizations, the Army Corps was forced by New York and New Jersey state governments to go back and revise the plan, and this time with community engagement and community input, as has been proposed earlier in this conversation. So let's move to the next slide. So this is what it could be. That you see a green band on the waterfront. We have no illusions that these polluting facilities will just disappear overnight. Many of these polluting facilities have long-term leases, and I'll get into some of the other solutions that can help to improve this area as well as the pollution burden. But first, just focusing on the green band. So soon after Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy, community members came together and envisioned what we call the Mott Haven-Port Morris Waterfront Plan, understanding that these types of superstorm events, sea level rise, coastal storms are only going to increase with climate change. And so we proposed 7 interconnected green spaces, very, very focused on nature-based solutions and green infrastructure that would create coastal resilience. And in terms of the polluting facilities that will continue to exist, we are also working to, for example, expedite the transition to electric vehicles. So instead of all of these fossil fuel fired or diesel engine trucks cutting through, slicing the community, at least they will be electric vehicles and limiting the pollution emitted into the air. One thing that I do want to point out is that all of this land that you see here, where all of these polluting facilities exist, this is New York State land. This is public land. This is New York State Department of Transportation land. Our first Governor Cuomo, the last Governor Cuomo's father, saw it appropriate to lease out this area for 99 years to a private for-profit business, which then subleased it to all of these polluting facilities. And there are 70 plus years left on these leases. So we have no illusions about these companies packing up and leaving. But what can we do with what we have? Retiring those power plants on an expedited timeline is something that we can do. Creating battery storage facilities maybe at those sites, and reducing the impact of truck vehicles or trucks and other vehicular traffic in the area. Transitioning over to electric are things that we can do to at least reduce the pollution. And in terms of the pollution, what I also want to just state is that it's not just asthma. We have an air quality monitoring project. We've deployed 65 air quality monitors across the South Bronx, and these are pretty sophisticated monitors that we got a grant from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation to purchase. They're collecting everything from particulate matter to gases, and so we now have good evidence to really show how poor the air quality is. But we know also that exposure to air pollution is related to a whole host of illnesses, including not just asthma, but poor maternal health, sometimes infant mortality, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and even dementia. So it impacts a person's, every cycle of a person's life is impacted by exposure to air pollution. And then that determines obviously the overall quality of life and what people are able to provide for subsequent generations. So it is not just a problem that we have right now. It's a problem that ripples across generations. And it's important for us to create more green spaces, increase our tree canopy. At the same time that we have this pollution burden, we also have a real dearth of green spaces. And so we have one real green space for 60,000+ people in our part of the South Bronx. The other green spaces that you might see on a map are essentially asphalt concrete parks that end up being heat traps on hot summer days. And we want to have them redesignated on maps to show them as gray infrastructure, not green infrastructure, because they're really not green. I don't know if you all have ever tried to, go on a slide on a hot summer day. You're going to burn your skin. I don't advise it, right? And so these are the kinds of parks that we have. And so these green spaces that we're wanting to create on the waterfront also serves that purpose of creating more direly needed green space in the community. One of the things that we are conscious of, there's been a lot of talk during this webinar about displacement and gentrification. We have no illusions about green spaces being connected and very, very, correlated with displacement and gentrification. I think, we believe that because ours is a community led plan that, hopefully some of those impacts will be limited, but we also can't take that for granted. And that's why it's so important to do community organizing in general, right? So at the same time that we do this green space equity work, at the same time that we work to reduce the impact of these polluting facilities on our community, we have to look at the whole picture, right? And so we have to do, we have to pay attention to, for example, new real estate developments. What kinds of principles can we, basically force these real estate developers to adopt, right? And as much as we're not doing it right now, I would advise that, groups doing green space equity work, groups doing work around the waterfront, also look at housing rights, tenants' rights type work, right? To make sure that people aren't displaced, to make sure that deeply affordable housing continues to exist, or exists. I mean, we have affordable housing in New York City, but affordable housing is a joke. It's really deeply affordable housing that we need. And I would also say, in addition to the measures that have already been proposed by Grace and Renee, that policymakers really need to be pushed to serve the community and center community priorities. Like the Fresh Direct operation that I mentioned, that was incentivized by policymakers. So making sure that we elect policymakers that reflect our priorities and our needs, and even getting to the point where we're running our own elected representatives, right? Or rather elected candidates, right? And so cultivating those leaders, starting from a young age, cultivating those leaders in our community so that when they do, so we can run them for elected office, and they understand because they've lived here, they've lived this experience, and they know what the realities are, because it takes all of us, community organizations and policymakers and urban planners and policymakers. And so one of the things that I've also recommended to people thinking about displacement and gentrification is making sure to get these types of conversations into policy schools and urban planning schools, right? There should be a course or at least discussions within courses on displacement and gentrification and the impacts of communities like ours. As someone who went to policy school at this point years ago, there was absolutely no talk about displacement or gentrification. They're very formulaic in terms of what types of things they discuss, and we need to push, where people are being educated, that they receive this type of education as well. Anyway, let's go to the next slide. This is an architectural drawing of one section of the 7 interconnected green spaces that we want to connect. And this is heading towards our waterfront. And the Randall's Island connector is something that also came about as a result of community advocacy. I spoke with you a little while ago on the first slide about the Randall's Island, which is the green space. So this Randall's Island connector actually connects the South Bronx to Randall's Island. However, very, very, very few people use this because where it's located right now, it's treacherous to get to. You have to contend with constant stream of trucks to reach it, number one. And number two, and you wouldn't have occasion to come out to this area because it's all industry. So yes, it exists, but unless it was made inviting, and unless there were other reasons to come out here, it's no surprise that it's not used much at all. Let's go to the next slide. I see the questions barely coming in, and I plan to read them after my presentation. So thank you for those questions. This is a section of our waterfront. This is closer to the water, just beyond the section that we just saw. Again, all of this area can be transformed. Again, even with some of the polluting infrastructure that exists adjacent to it, and hopefully that will at least we'll be able to bring about some pollution calming measures. We can still have these green spaces. We can still make the waterfront accessible. Again, right now the waterfront is entirely inaccessible. The areas that are accessible, people would have no occasion to come out to. Let's go to the next slide. So we talked about how displacement and gentrification can be addressed through community-driven design. And our organization is a community-rooted, community-founded, and community-led organization. And I just wanted to show you some pictures of the way we go about doing design. So we can move to the next slide. This is a demonstration that we had going to our waterfront, where we drew attention to the waterfront and our desire to have access to it. One of the things that I will say that I should mention, and it's critical here, especially in the context of this discussion, is that much of the work that we do is also through our community land trust. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the community land trust model, I encourage you to learn more about it. It is a very, very important way of asserting community self-determination, and also making sure that spaces in our community, whether that's private spaces, including buildings that maybe tenants can come together to purchase, or public spaces, including the waterfront. Again, I mentioned that's New York State Department of Transportation land. You see a sign that says public land for public good. This public land, this land that is being used by these polluting facilities, should not be for public poison. This is our land. Our tax dollars have paid for it and are paying for it. And so in essence, we are subsidizing the poisoning of our own air with this public land. And that's just I mean, it's unconscionable and it's difficult to imagine, but we're drawing attention to this. We want to make sure that when we think about public land, that it is immediately for public good, and also through the community land trust model, we'll be able to create everything from public spaces that center public priorities, but also some of the legislation that we're working on in New York City is, for example, when real estate landlords want to sell their building, let's say, they that community land trusts and nonprofit organizations will get the first right of refusal. So, giving access to those buildings for community land trusts and nonprofits to purchase at market rate. We have no illusions about that, but still, it's not that it would go directly to the private real estate market. So I would encourage you all to look at the community land trust model as an important vehicle through which to really address or to prevent displacement. So let's go to the next slide. This is a waterfront tour that we did. We do a lot of waterfront tours to draw attention to our polluted waterfront and at the same time to invite people to envision a different future for it, right? It's important to bring people out to both make them angry and upset because they should be, and then also to really encourage them to think about how this space that we have right on the waterfront can be re-envisioned. The buildings that you see right across the water, that's Harlem. Harlem is just a stone's throw away from our part of the South Bronx. So move on to the next slide, please. Another waterfront tour, this one on bikes. So, we've done it on bikes. Those school buses that you see, this is a hybrid tour. Those are electric school buses that we were able to get for this tour. We were able to cover more ground. Again, we do regular waterfront tours as a way to really strengthen our advocacy. Let's go to the next slide. This is an event at a community garden. We bring in culture and arts to all of our events. We got to make it fun, always good food as well at our events. But community events are bedrock of the way we do advocacy. Let's go to the next slide. Just another community event, and this one you see young people. We have to make sure that we bring young people into this. It's a cliche, but they are our future. If we really get them to start thinking about these issues now, and can continue to engage them, again, they will become policymakers. They will become move into positions of power and become advocates and community organizers. And so it's important that we engage them now. Let's move to the next slide. This is a charrette activity that we did for our waterfront. So we often work with landscape architects, and Olin Architecture has been a real great friend over the years, providing us with a pro bono support. And then with this particular engagement, this happened just about 8-9 months ago. One Architecture, which is also a great firm, they did the map printouts for us, and we engaged community members on how to re-envision 2 sections of our waterfront. We applied for the EPA Community Change Grant. Everyone and their grandmothers applied to that, and I felt like we had a good shot, but I think with the new administration and given that we didn't get in our application until towards the end, I think our chances are now a little diminished. But anyway, the point is that we engage our community in every aspect, both from demonstrations and marches to charrette activities. Please go to the next slide. Another a different one, another charrette that we did also for this particular engagement. This one was at our office. And these types of activities are always fun. Visuals are always engaging. Physical visuals. I mean, I think we're living in a digital world, and that can be very helpful. But physical visuals, large maps, it's just nice. Get out the markers, get out the maps, get out the stickies. Gets people excited. Let's go to the next slide. I think that this is, I think, the final slide. This is after another engagement we did, really incorporating arts. The woman at the center is a local artist, and it was just a nice day to be out there on the waterfront and really asserting ourselves on this patch of grass, which is right on the waterfront, and making sure that there are many people in our community who do not know that the water is right there because there's no occasion to come out there. There's nothing bringing them out there. And so really, getting people out on the waterfront and engaging them in these types of activities is a very, very important tool for advocacy. And immediately next to this patch, there are 7 luxury high rises that just went up within the last year. And they, because of, I think, uh, either tax abatements or deals that they got into with city government, they were required to create some waterfront green space. These green spaces are, nice enough, but there was no community engagement in that process. And one of the things we've told them is, yeah, you got this space now, but it feels like a private space because community members don't know about it. They have no occasion to come out here. So put signage up in the interior of the community so that they know that this is there. They haven't done it yet, but we're going to keep pushing them to do that. But I'll stop here. I've said a lot, and really want to thank you for this forum and this opportunity. And thank you for listening. And feel free to be in touch with us. I'll also drop my email into chat. But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Arif, Renee, and Grace. Yeah, really, really great presentation. So we're going to jump right into the audience Q&A now. If you all have any additional questions, feel free to throw it in the chat. And so the first question that I had in the chat was, how directly is green infrastructure implicated in gentrification? Might it be an association rather than a cause of gentrification and displacement? Renee suggested checking out the Center for Neighborhood Technologies report on green stormwater infrastructure impact on property value. Renee, is there anything else that you, Grace, or Reef wanted to share around that question?
No, I mean, I think that there are levels of, for sure, and green infrastructure, depending on how large the installation, isn't going to cause as much change as a large park development, for example. So that report that I referenced, and thank you, Jaleesa and Natalia, for dropping it in the chat again, does go into green stormwater installations and how they do affect property values, which can be a positive. We're not saying it's a negative thing by any means. Making those healthy and vibrant communities and preventing flooding is good for everyone. And so I guess I'll just leave it there and see if maybe Grace or Arif have anything to add.
Thanks, Renee. I think you answered it well. I have nothing else to add.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. I would just say that yes, there are certainly links to green infrastructure and gentrification and displacement. And at the same time, communities like the South Bronx need green infrastructure. So how do we do it in a way that is responsible? There's a model that we have been thinking about, really exploring, that was recommended to us by Friends of the High Line, which didn't employ this model when the High Line was being created. But I think it's called like the values capture model, where there can be sort of like uh, tax income that can be looked at as a way to fund community efforts, even prevent or minimize displacement when green spaces like the High Line are built. I mean, with the High Line, the initial gentrifiers have been gentrified out. That's how gentrification has hit that area.
Thank you. And so another question that we had, I think, Arif, this was directly for you. Have you thought about how to acquire land from the industries that may move out once their lease expires?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. In fact, we have been um, looking at this one site. So it was on our waterfront and just next to a section of the waterfront that we want to build up into a green space, is a former New York Post / Wall Street Journal printing press. And it's a pretty modern facility. They built it and they left, like I think a few years later. So we have been trying to find out how we can have conversations around that. It's a very large space. We have been looking at that space as a potential location for a large green workforce development center, as a community that um, has a high unemployment rate. And also, as we transition into a green economy, there are opportunities that are becoming available that our community just isn't trained for. And so, yes, we have and are looking into spaces. The power plants that I mentioned, we have been looking into how they can be but not just battery storage facilities, but also a hybrid like battery storage facilities / green space. There are technologies available that allow battery storage facilities not to exist underground, and there'll be, sort of more progress on that front. And so, um, we haven't done as much as we would like to as a tiny staff with limited capacity. But if you have any ideas, please feel free to be in touch with me.
Yeah, thank you. And then there was another question, Ari, for you about do you have designated truck routes in the South Bronx? And they also mentioned other ideas, anti-idling ordinances, tree buffers, green roofs. And then they also applaud your effort for advocating for EV trucks and clean ports.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you're speaking our language here. And yes, there are truck routes across the city, and we've examined those truck routes. There are bus routes as well. And we have been in some conversations about how those routes can be rerouted. And at the same time, we have no illusions about the fact that some of those truck routes are also highways. And so New York City just implemented congestion pricing. On the surface, and in principle, we are in support of congestion pricing. And at the same time, what congestion pricing is going to do, and we're collecting, data around this, is it's going to redirect at least some of that traffic to the South Bronx. It's going to add additional pollution burden to our community. And so, it's been really disappointing that some of our environmental organization friends have been so gung-ho about congestion pricing, when this will be the repercussion. We've been forced to shoulder the burden for the public good over and over again, whether it's with power plants, these last mile warehouses, and now we're being forced to shoulder that burden again with congestion pricing. And so some of it can be addressed, some of it, just because of the highways that were, built through and around our communities, thanks to Robert Moses. It's not possible to redirect those truck routes. But we have hope for electrification. Idling is something that is not enforced in the South Bronx, where it is in other communities, and so that's something that we've looked into as well. But it is a multi-pronged approach. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, this question is from Kimberly, and I see you have your hand up, Kimberly, so I'll read your question. If you want to add any context, please feel free. So how do we keep this concern about green infrastructure contributing to gentrification from being used against efforts to improve with green infrastructure disadvantaged communities that really need greening and cooling? And Kimberly, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure. I'm in the Southwest, and there's a big disparity between affluent communities and the tree canopy, and that has many implications for health and many other things. So one can easily see how people who want to make an argument against continuing to invest in some areas and not in others could use this to justify the status quo. And so rather than a question, I guess, just for us to think about how we frame this and how we speak about it to prevent such misuse of this finding.
I can speak a little bit to that. And Kimberly, fellow Southwest person over here, I'm from Arizona originally, so I understand those and have been living around some of those impacts as well. I think it can be used as an argument, right, to go beyond what we have traditionally done. So kind of what we talked about in the beginning of that business as usual model. I think these fears and concerns that are absolutely valid, right? And there are all these examples that this work can lead to displacement and a change in community is an argument to go beyond and to think about building multi-sector partnerships to really uplift, as I kind of see here in some of the comments, the community voice, identify those leaders, making sure that the community is centered in all of this work. So it's an absolutely valid fear, and I think it can be used as sort of power to move us beyond what the traditional work has been, and think, how can we be different moving forward? And using that as the argument. But I think it's a really great point. I don't know if, yeah, Arif or Renee, you want to add anything?
Something that we could see in the near future?
I would just add, I guess, for some of the folks doing the work and who coined the term within gentrification is something that a lot of people are using as, yes, we want to do this work, yes, we want to lead this work, and we want to see these improvements in our neighborhoods. And so really just starting with the community and articulating that it is a priority for the community as well as other multiple benefits for that green infrastructure.
And I think that one of the things important to bring up when discussing gentrification and associated that occurs when green infrastructure is implemented in communities is just to be more nuanced and talk about the many factors that influence people's decisions to move. So yeah, just a thought. Thanks.
Yes, yeah, thank you for bringing that up too. We do go into that a little bit in the toolkit and some of the deeper discussions about, folks might choose to leave the neighborhood anyway, even if they're advocating for it. So it's really just allowing people to have the choice to stay is the way that I think we would rather talk about it. But thank you. Yes, that's very important. I know we're coming to the end of our time. Do we have time for another question, Jaleesa, or is there another one to?
I think we have 2 minutes for you all to share any final thoughts or key takeaways that you want to share with our audience today. Excuse me, before we wrap it up.
This water doing so right now, and what they
I guess I just always want to express a lot of gratitude. Staying on. This is an 1.5 hour long webinar. Thank you. Gratitude to Arif for being here with us. We would never have been able to put together a toolkit without folks like Arif sharing their stories, and really just, thanks for everyone's interest in this important topic, and keep engaging with us. And I saw a lot of email addresses dropping in the chat. So look for more in the new year.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to Grace, Renee, and River Network for putting together this toolkit, for being interested in speaking with us, and for really lifting up these very, very important issues. One of the things that was mentioned is DEI trainings. Something I would add to that is there's an excellent organization that's been doing undoing racism trainings for a long time. They're called the People's Institute, and they really get at it. I think DEI, not to diminish that, but I would, my preference is for what they do with undoing racism, and again, it's called the People's Institute. And again, thank you, Renee, Grace, and Jaleesa, and everyone here for for just being interested in this issue and for continuing to talk about it. The more we talk about it, the more people will know about it, and let's just keep pushing it.
Excuse me. Thank you so much, Renee and Grace, for sharing that toolkit with us. It's a really powerful resource, and if you haven't checked it out yet, definitely dive into it. Arif, thank you so much for sharing all the work that you and the community are doing in the South Bronx. And so, yeah, I just want to thank the speakers, thank all the participants again, our audience members. Connect with us through the Urban Waters Learning Network. We'd love to chat with you all and, work together and keep creating stuff like this and solutions. And we have an evaluation link for today's webinar, so please fill that out when you get a chance. Right after this is probably preferable. And join us again. We're having 2 other sessions in the Silos to Synergies learning series, and upcoming in March and May. So I hope to see everyone there. And thank you again. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your days.
Grace, did you want to say what you dropped in the chat? I think that, no, okay.
Well, I
I bet-
can. It's just as we quickly close, we're always so interested to hear any stories or practices that folks across the country are working on related to this topic. And it's helpful to share any learnings that you have or challenges even with all of you so that we can continue to be connected no matter where we are. So reach out with anything as it comes up.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.